Good morning, dearest friends. Welcome. It is Monday. Now, Rebel, I need to get my bearings here. We are in February 7th and Adar the 6th. Adar Rishon. And we are studying the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. At the moment, Maseches Shabbos, chapter 11, page 101b. Today, we're going to close out our Shabbos on the High Seas series, and we're going to proceed with a final Mishnah of the chapter, introducing a host of important and just slightly complex aspects of carrying and zorek, and I think we'll find it quite illuminating and interesting. We dedicate our learning for the well-being of our dear members of our Chabura and their households. Hashem should give strength and koyach and health and all good circumstances to those who attend and their loved ones who either attend, although not always in the frame, and those that allow our Chabura to continue. So it's very, very special. And again, only good health and sustained well-being for everyone. Let's dedicate our learning as well for Yehuda Leib and Chaim Yaakov, whose yard site was on Shabbos. And again, a prayer for well-being for all of Klal Yisrael. So as you may recall, we've been talking about Shabbos on the high seas. And even though, of course, I would stand corrected, as long as we're talking about drawing drinking water, they probably were not on the high seas. They were in a river or Kinneret. And we spoke of a variety of size boats and type of boats. And again, the general beginning of the conversation had to do with the status of the sea as a Carmelite, meaning that although biblically it was not considered although biblically it is not a Rishus, it's certainly not a Rishus Harabim nor a Rishus HaYachid, but there are restrictions for carrying, throwing, or conveying something from a Carmelist to a Rishus HaYachid, assuming the boat is a Rishus HaYachid. And so there were methods and techniques to allow bringing stuff onto the boat, taking stuff off to the boat. We were also mindful of the dimensions, the height of the water, the height of the seabed, the size of the boats, the bottom of the boats, if there was any kind of platform. And then lastly, and this is what we talked of on Friday, was the permission, the ability, this is based on the Mishnah, the ability to carry from one boat to the other when they're tied together. Shalom, you want to see who's at the door? The ability to carry from one boat to the other when they are tied. And we mentioned that this was there was a consideration about an Eruv, because we're talking about two boats with two different owners. And although it's not a typical two private domains with a common mavoy, a common walkway, but yet an Eruv was necessary. And when the ties were severed, that Eruv automatically is severed, and they are no longer connected and bound as a single Rishus HaYachid. The surprising thing is that if you retie them on Shabbos, whether it was intentional or inadvertent, etc., well then the Eruv is reactivated, which was somewhat surprising to us, that you could reactivate the Eruv. If you recall, we then brought another analogy, which was if you took mats and constructed a bunch of cubicles, little Rishus HaYachids with a self-standing mat in a public domain, so one is allowed to carry from one to the other. And if it came down and then was reconstructed, they are reactivated again. And the Gemara asked, hold on, are you allowed to build something intentional on Shabbos? And we compared and contrasted it with our story here with the boats. And suffice it to say, there's a distinction between if it was B'mezid or B'shoyig, and I don't want to revisit it in depth, but just to, that was the overview of our previous discussion. We're now going to explore this final aspect of the boats being tied together. And let's share the screen. Let's take a look. Again, today is our last segment of Shabbos on the high seas. Here we go. Amar Shmuel. Let's change the format to our preferred. Amar Shmuel. Shmuel said the following teaching. We say that boats are tied together. They are considered bound and connected for the purposes of an Eruv. Well, what does it mean that the boat is bound? As we know, there are different types of grades of rope, chains. Try to use a shoelace. You could try to use some floss. There's a lot of different options you might try to use to tie together a boat. When do we say that the boat is considered properly tied, and when is the boat not properly tied? So Shmuel says any type of string. Afilu kshurais v'chut hasarbal, even if it's been tied by the string on a cloak. I'm thinking about a hoodie drawstring, but I don't think that's really what we're talking about. Talking about some kind of very relatively thin, weak string that's used in clothing. Now, admittedly, where's Reb Beryl? Reb Beryl, you're on here? There's less tension and pressure on the two sides of a cloak being held together than two very heavy boats floating at sea, right?
But Rabbi,
yes.
The obvious question is not what kind of rope it's tied to, but how well the boat is tied. If it's in a place where a little string would hold it, what you want is how much is the boat moving, no?
This is indeed a good point. But that's not our point. It is a good point because no, what I mean to say is because there's the other question, which I think is actually more on our radar, which is different types of knots or different types of conditions, right? And so you have a sailor's knot, and then you have a rabbi's knot, and they're not always the same, the same quality. But here we're assuming, I think, that the knots are done properly, but still, depending on how much weight and the strength of the rope, might predict or determine the durability and how long these two ships are going to stay connected. So I don't know if I addressed your question. I think it's a good one, but
what about?
Yeah, go ahead.
What about the distance between the two boats? Because if you take any form of rope and you give enough slack to it, 10 feet of slack when they're a foot away, the boats by the dock or the pier, wherever, it's not going to rip in half because it's not going to really move.
This is a good point. I'll tell you why it's such a good point, because we talked about how there's a little boat, a little dinghy in between. And so there must have been some degree of slack. And that's a good point. We haven't given specific measures or descriptions of this sort. I imagine we just have to assume that it was the standard technique and method of tying boats together. So if there was, so you're right, there probably was some kind of slack, but the reason why, and I believe this is the case, again, I don't have a lot of experience with boating. I have gone on a boat a few times, but I think you generally do want to leave a little bit of slack. You don't want it to be immediately taut because you're asking for trouble before you start. So there must have been some kind of slack. But I think even with the slack, you assume, let's say you tie a boat to a dock, you assume there are going to be times that the boat's going to test the full strength of the rope, but you hope that that's not the majority of the time. So these are all good things to consider, and they don't seem to be immediately addressed, although I imagine the further conversations, I mean, not in the Gemara, but I imagine the halachis or the commentaries we discuss and really go in depth probably would want to consider Beryl's comment and Dr. Beryl's comment. And so let us see how the Gemara unfolds. And indeed, it is interesting.
Slack for the tide going up and down.
Oh, and then we have an issue of tide. You're saying that's why you leave slack?
Yeah, because otherwise, if it goes down, the boat could be hanging sort of on the rope.
Right. But again, we're talking at sea, so the both items are going to be the same height, but there's a lot of waves and how do you call it? Currents, and so we can expect that there's going to be a lot of anyways, the rope's going to have to perform well, otherwise the boats are not going to stay attached. And indeed, let me ask a question. Anchors, a little different, but how are anchors attached to boats? So I don't know I don't know today like what an anchor. I don't think I've ever. But usually, certainly the way we portray on on our favorite pirate ships, or our, I think it's usually with chains, right?
Yeah.
Because there we're talking about a prolonged submersion and a lot of pressure, and we certainly want to have only the very best, strongest items keeping our boats secure. So let's see the Gemara. Amar Shmuel, the halacha that says that two boats that are tied are considered connected. Afilu kshurais b'chot hasarbel, even if they are tied with this very minuscule, relatively soft, weak rope. Gemara asks a very good question. Hey chidami, what are we talking about? It's a very good, basic Gemara kind of logic. If we know this rope is strong enough to hold them together, pshita, then obviously they are connected. And if it is not strong enough to hold them, amai, why do we consider them connected? Right? You'll take a piece of spaghetti and you tie it between two boats. So long as the boats are attached, probably there's slack, as the doctor pointed out. The first moment that there's it's tight, it's going to snap. So just because the picture looks like there's something connecting and they're not connected. So what are we talking about? If it works, then it should be absolutely fine. If it doesn't work, it's entirely problematic. So what really is Shmuel teaching us? And again, just to point out, Rashi says, "Lahamidon." What does it mean to hold them together? Shelo yitpardu, that they don't come apart. And again, this is so. Let's revisit what we're talking about. We're talking about a case on Shabbos. You want to be able to carry from one boat to the other boat, and if the two boats are tied together, well then, along with whatever the mechanism of the Erev works, they're now connected. They're now considered a fused, combined unit. They have to actually be connected. They don't have to have the appearance of connection. This is not a fiction. This is not a picture. It needs to really work. So what's Shmuel saying? It's a simple question. It's well presented. And the Gemara explains, what are we really talking about here? Excuse me. So make sure we have the right place here. The Yachal Hamidim. We are talking about, of course, a situation where the boats can be held together. So spaghetti is not going to fly. So what's going on over here? Shmuel has a very specific personal reason why he needed to specify that it could be any type of material that is not so much connected to the laws of Shabbos, but more connected to other aspects of Hilchas boats. So we spoke about Judy. We spoke about the laws of Jewish practice on this and at sea, right? So on Friday, I think or Thursday, we sent the link of a number of articles, and there are many more, about how to do a cruise on Shabbos, because there are many different factors to consider. Well, going more fundamentally to the question of being at sea on Shabbos, a Jew at sea has other halachic issues beyond Shabbos. So when it comes to cruise, we spoke of kashrus. Maybe we'll talk about zmanim, when to pray, and how to orient oneself when prayer, right? So there are other, again, this is totally off the topic of Shabbos. Well, in temple times, or in times where there was a hakpada, a concern about tahara, about ritual purity, well, that was a whole other section of Jewish practice that one needed to take into account if they were a seafaring person. And here is what Shmuel taught in that area, and we'll understand why he had the need to specify the material that binds these two boats together. Shmuel, he was coming really to clarify or to make clear, because he had other statements on the record about boats. Tnan, here is the Mishnah that teaches as follows. Kishara bedavar hamamida, two boats are tied together with a type of material that can really hold them together. Maybe latuma, impurity is conveyed from one boat to the other. Let's read Rashi. Mimilsa da Amar be'alma, being that there was something that he said that's not immediately relevant to our topic. What did he say? Rashi is going to give us a spoiler alert. He was of the opinion that for the conveyance of ritual impurity, the two boats need to be bound together with a strong iron chain. And being that Shmuel had this strong position that for the purposes of conveying ritual impurity, it needs to be made of iron, he therefore felt it necessary to clarify that for the purposes of Shabbos and for the two boats for one to be allowed to carry from one boat to the other, Shmuel relaxes the requirements to be considered connected. And after we learn the Gemara, we can consider why there may be distinctions between how bound the boat needs to be for Tumah versus how bound the boat needs to be for Shabbos. So again, back to here. The Mishnah teaches that a boat that's tied to another boat. I'm sorry, I take it back. We're not necessarily talking about tying two boats. We're talking here about tying something to a ship. A boat is tied to something that was an oil. So again, our Shabbos, we're talking about tying two boats together. In impurity, again, Shara, B'davar Hamamida, Rashi says, a chain, a rope, is tied on one side to something that is covering over meaning it's a roof that is over a corpse. And the rope runs under there and ties a boat. Again, it has the capacity to convey ritual impurity to the articles on the boat. And under the circumstances where a boat can also become tamei, it would also convey ritual impurity to a boat. So Shmuel's talking about a chain that runs, or a rope that runs from a boat, from the oil hames, or a place where there's a corpse, which is a prime, most potent source of ritual impurity. And if it's tied to a boat, the boat and what's on it can also become impure. And Shmuel clarifies and says, Amar Shmuel v'hu shekshura b'shal shelas shal barzel. That conveyance of ritual impurity would only work if it was an iron, very, very strong chain. So being that for the laws of impurity, something is only considered attached to a boat with the strongest type of material. In the laws of Shabbos, he says it need not be a chain. Rashi, going immediately to lav mateches, ain maybe latuma. Oh, by the way, I should back up and say this. A 20-foot boat and a 30-foot boat is tied with ropes, correct? I have a friend, maybe some of us, we have a mutual friend that has a boat, and you use ropes to tie a boat. But if you're talking about anchoring or tying down a cruise ship, or those large freight, what do you call them? The boats that carry containers. We're talking about massive boats, an aircraft carrier, something that's of great magnitude. Maybe they use ropes, but I imagine they probably use stronger material. So now let's go back to the time of the Mishnah. We're talking about something that's probably larger than a 20-foot boat, smaller than an aircraft carrier. And so for there, especially with the ropes they had, they needed chains.
Have I?
Hold on. Let me just finish this Rashi. Here, go ahead, Rabbi Rashi. Go ahead.
Before I leave, why don't they ask a more obvious question? What if there's Tuma on one boat? Does it transfer to the other boat?
Maybe they do ask that question. I don't know. But what we do know is that Shmuel's comment was in this scenario, which was a boat that was moored, that was attached to an oil hamas. So it's a good question. I don't know why, but this is where the conversation went, and therefore that's what the Gemara is reporting to us. When we get to the study of the laws of ritual impurity more exhaustively, it's possible that your question is addressed, or at least the answer would be somewhere in between the lines. So that is the reason why Shmuel specifically mentions even weaker type of ropes. Yeah, Rashi. When it says that it's really attached properly, we're talking about iron. Maybe chains is the truest and most absolute type of connection, and therefore that's when impurity would be conveyed in such a manner. Now, why is it so? Why is it that when it comes to impurity, it needs to be of metal? When it comes to Shabbos, not? So the Gemara explains. When it comes to the laws of ritual impurity, and particularly a mess. So the Torah says, Chalal cherev, a person that's killed by a sword. And the Chazal say, Cherev harehu kechalal. A sword becomes as potent to convey tumah as a corpse itself. Therefore, a metal instrument that comes into contact with the corpse assumes the same level of tumah as the corpse. That would only exist by an iron chain. An iron chain, being that if it touches an oil, becomes like a corpse. Therefore, when the corpse, by the Rashi says this, but it's when the chain touches the boat can end up becoming impure. The string, however, does not convey ritual impurity. That's in that manner. And so Shmuel's comment that it needs to be of iron is only nogeya. It's only relevant to the unique laws of tumah, of a tumas mess. In Shabbos, when it comes to talking about Shabbos, kiva the yochel hamida, if it's able to hold the two boats together, heker ba'almahu, it's only meant to be a visual declaration that these two boats are staying together. Afilu b'chut hasarbal, and no matter the type of material, so long as it actually holds them together, that is all that is needed.
Okay.
So again,
I'm bailing. Sorry.
So the bottom line is as follows. Our Mishnah that talks about boats being tied together, Shmuel clarifies that it means any kind of strong rope that will hold them together. The Gemara asks, who needs that? Isn't it obvious? If the boats are tied, if the boats stay together, it's good. If not, not. And so the Gemara answered, you're right. Shmuel, because he has an interesting take on another law about a boat where he needs a chain, he therefore clarifies when it comes to Shabbos, it could be any type of strong material. That's the Gemara. We are now ready to enter our final Mishnah of chapter 11. I want to go through this, not slowly, but I want to go through this carefully. And Be'ezer Hashem, tomorrow we will hopefully make a siyum on this chapter. So again, this closes, we turn to page 102, and we also close the door for now on this section called Shabbos and the High Seas. Any comments or questions as we close out our seafaring discussion? Alan, we don't hear you. Is there something wrong with your sound?
I think he's drugged.
All right, Alan, we want to hear what you're saying, but I know how to read eyes, but I don't know how to read lips. Okay, I'm kidding. But we have said that one of the interesting upsides of masking is that we are accustomed to recognizing and identifying people by all of their facial features. And sometimes we forget that the most important window to a person's expression is their eyes. And so masking, although the circumstance of masking certainly is regrettable, we don't want to have an illness that we need to wear a mask, and it's not necessarily comfortable to wear a mask, but it did afford us the opportunity to realize that there's so much that can be conveyed, both expression and identity and feelings and whatever through the eyes. But yet, Reb Allen, if you could figure out, we'd love you to figure out how to have your sound attached. I want to hear what you're saying. Maybe your headphones are not plugged in properly, so it's not picking up your sound. Let me try. I'm going to mute you. Try to hit unmute now. Maybe that'll help. Try again. No, something to do with your speaker. All right, we're going to continue. Alan, as soon as your sound works, please, we want to hear your thoughts. So, all right, so our chapter from the beginning chapter 11, which has been a fairly short chapter, opens up and is entitled Hazorik. And so we have the opportunity to consider many facets of the act of throwing something on Shabbos. And although throwing is considered a malacha, the malacha of getting something from point A to point B, if it's from a Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah, it would be considered Hotzah. And if it was from 4 Amis in a Rosh Hashanah, it would be considered Havara, moving something that distance. But it's given us, Alan, say something.
Can you hear me now?
We hear you now.
You
welcome
do?
back. We
Oh.
hear you. We hear you.
Okay, there's just something I wanted to clear up. We mentioned previously that, or you mentioned previously, that if two boats were tied together at sea and there was a little boat in between,
Yeah.
what did that little
I-
boat serve? Was that to cross over to the next boat?
Apparently, possibly. That's what the Gemara mentioned. I didn't make it
Because I
up.
find that impossible.
The Gemara talks about a little dinghy that's somehow wedged between two larger boats. I imagine it played the role of a how do you call it? Of a dock. Of
But I
sorts.
find that impossible.
Why? It would
because
get crushed.
The big boats are like in a big V.
I don't know exactly how it would work. I'm just going to take the Gemara's word, or I've chosen, until you've asked me to really think about this, and I want to thank you for that. I took the Gemara's word for it that somehow a boat fit wedged between them. But I don't know the exact nature or the exact layout of how it worked.
Because all the sailboats were in a V.
So hold on. So let's say you have two V's. They come to a point at one end and they're wider at the other end. And so if the two boats are flush with one another, in the area where they become more rounded, you could conceive of a small boat wedged somewhere within there, right?
But you
It
could
could
have
work.
20 feet. You could have 20 feet difference in between each
Yeah.
boat. Because those are
Yeah.
massive boats.
Yeah.
And if it's, if the sides of the boats were straight up and down, like a box, then the dinghy would be crushed. So I don't
Yeah.
understand what happened there, what that whole thing's about.
Yeah. So I don't know the exact. I just know what the Gemara taught us, which is
Yeah,
that it's conceivable that if the boat is very snug and secure between the two boats, then one might be able to traverse between those two boats and that boat in between as well, even if it's not tied in, which was the point the Gemara was making. But you know what we need to do is we need to do a field trip. We need to go down to Bayside and take a look at how the boats are aligned. And then if that's not enough, we should go down to the port of Miami. Actually, we can go to the Fort Lauderdale. We can go to Port Everglades.
Yaffo. We should go to
Yaffo.
Yaffo.
Oh, let's go to Yaffo. I agree.
Yaffo.
Akko, yeah, Akko.
Actually, hold on. Anyone here from Connecticut? I think over there they have like historic, American ports where they have like some of the, what's it called? What's it called? Anyways, so yeah,
Our group should make a day trip.
we are due a field trip.
Just bring me lots of vodka.
Shabbaton in Yerushalayim.
That would be nice. That would be very nice. Anyone here have a spare private jet by any chance? To make things much easier. All right.
We have a pilot, a co-head pilot. We have.
Pilot we have. Okay. All right, let's take a stab at the next mission. This is gonna get us thinking. Hazayrek, a person throws something. And Rashi right away says, Bishogeg. Whatever the exact definition of Bishogeg is, he didn't realize that what he was doing was not a Shabbos appropriate action. Again, I don't want to revisit exactly. It was a shogeg. He didn't realize that he was throwing in a way that was prohibited, or that it was prohibited. As the item leaves his hand, he's like, "Oh, 1 second. this is a problem. This is not a Shabbos. This is not something I should be doing on Shabbos. Or maybe he said, oh, well, I am no longer in a Rishos HaYachid. The Erev is down. I don't know. We have to think exactly how this was what the shogeg was. Once he throws it or after he throws it, he realizes that it was a shogeg. Kol ta'achar. But now instead of it going and continuing its natural progression, somebody intercepted it. Someone caught it. Or kol ta'kelev. A dog intercepted it. Oisha nisrifa, or it ends up getting burnt. So the halacha is pater. The person is exempt. He has not successfully done an act of zoyrek, throwing something either for Amos in the public domain or from one domain to the other. He tried doing a malacha. Oh, no, well, not he tried. His action should have led to a malacha. And it would have been a shogeg, so he would have had to bring a chatas. But even if a factor, and I'm explaining it simply, but we'll see the Gemara is going to have a lot of different ways to examine and explore this scenario. But although he intended to do an act which inadvertently would have created a shogeg, because his action was terminated, and what was meant to happen didn't happen, pater, he does not bring a chatas. Now, I was stammering and saying, what's the shogeg? But actually, Rashi helps us out. The shogeg was he forgot it was Shabbos. In Niskar, Rashi says, Shu Shabbos. He remembers that it is Shabbos. So is there a problem throwing something in the weekdays? As long as it is safe, not going to harm anybody, it's either permissible or a mitzvah, depending on what you're doing. But here, you forgot it was Shabbos, and then you remember, oh, it's Shabbos. Maybe somebody walked by wearing a talis in a Shabbos kind of way, or Rashi after it left his hand, but before it came to rest. Kol ta'achar. Let's read Rashi here carefully. Someone else caught it. Because here we are under the impression that after the guy recalls that it is Shabbos, Kol ta'achar, then someone else caught it. If that's the case, why should you be pater? Why should a person be pater if someone else catches his item? It turns out that he did not do the act of haitzah on his own. Someone else helped him. How would that have to work? It would have to be that the guy actually got up and made an effort to catch it. Or the dog jumped up to catch it with his mouth. So they have a hanacha to be in a makam dalid in potter. So I think what he's saying is like this: if you throw something to a person and the person stays sitting and it lands on his lap, well then, or into the person's hand, you may be chayiv because the person didn't catch it; he was just a landing spot. But here, where the person proactively is involved in the act of catching, where the dog is active in the act of catching, well then the person is pater. What's confusing here, Rashi points this out, is that there are two aspects. There is the change of his awareness, and there is the interference of his act. And the question is pater only when both come together, or is it either or? And that's going to be the subject of the Gemara's analysis. But at this point, the Mishnah tells us a person did an act. His awareness changes, and something interferes, then pater. Now it's going to get even more interesting. Zorak lasois chabura. You threw a rock. You're a very loving, kind person. And the point of throwing the rock is to cause harm, to hurt someone. Shouldn't do it. It's a very bad thing to do. Bein ba'adam, bein b'behema. Whether your intention was to harm a person or an animal, V'niskar actually nasas chabura, and before the person is injured or the animal is injured, he remembers, oh, I don't want to hurt somebody on Shabbos because it's a malacha. I think that's what we're saying. He's pater. Give me a second. No, I'm sorry. Here we're talking about the throwing aspect. We're not talking about the chabura. We need to talk about the chabura aspect separately. But as far as the melacha of throwing is concerned, by remembering that it's Shabbos and not wanting to throw the item, he is pater. Why is he pater? Let's see if Rabbi Steinsaltz gives us any information. So I know this sounds like one of our pet peeves, which is when a person is very, very frum bein adam lamakom, when a person is very meticulous about his observance of Yiddishkeit when it comes to between man and God, but unfortunately very not keen or very not careful about being adam lachaveiroi. And of course we know that Judaism has mitzvot that are between man and also mitzvahs that are between man and God. And the idea is that we have to keep them on equal footing, and to only observe Torah mitzvot between man and God and to forget about one's fellow person is not considered successful Jewish observance. And of course, it's a pet peeve because unfortunately, to our great shame, there are people out there that forget this balance. And so I would think that a person throwing a rock to hurt someone only to say, oh no, I never meant to do that, not because he's hurting the person, but because of Shabbos, that's a disappointing situation. But I don't think our Mishnah is giving commentary on that. The Mishnah is giving us technical commentary on the change of a person's machshava during throwing on Shabbos. But of course, it's very natural that we're going to have our machshava. Give me another moment here. Hi, Nechama. What? Yeah, Tati's going to finish the shir and then we're going to talk, okay?
Okay.
You want to say hello to everyone, then I'm going to finish the shir? Come, you can say hi to everybody. Come, you want to say hi to everyone? Come. All right, sorry. Say hi to everybody. Say good morning.
Hi.
Good morning.
Hi.
You see everyone, she doesn't hear everyone. Everyone's saying hi, like they're waving to you.
Hi.
You want to wave back?
No.
All right. Okay, come. Oh God. But you can sit here actually, but all right. So basically, if the person intends to throw it, it causes harm, and he remembers that he shouldn't be throwing pater. We will discuss in the Gemara why and how. So I know it's aggravating to leave this hanging, but that's what the Mishnah is going to do for us. Zehakal. Now we get a general rule, and this too is going to be analyzed and deciphered in the Gemara. Kol chayav chatos. When a person does something that would make them chayav chatos, and why is a person chayav chatos? Why does a person have to bring a sin offering? Because they did an act that's a high
Crime.
high crime in Judaism, but they did it inadvertently, b'shogeg. So then you bring a chatas. But when does a person have to bring a chatas? Einon chayavin ad shetehei tchilasan v'soifan shkaga. The definition of a shogeg is that from the beginning of the act to the end of the act, the person consistently is doing it unintentionally. If it's a little more complicated, tchilasan shkaga, he starts off unintentionally. But at the end of the process or towards the middle of the process, he realizes that what he's doing is not allowed. Or tchilasan zadin, he initiated this process realizing it's prohibited. But towards the end, somehow he forgets. All of these scenarios where it's not a beginning to end shogeg, piturim, the person is pater from bringing a carbon chatas, tehei, tchilasan v'soifan shagaga. It has to be from the beginning to the end inadvertently. Now let me make an important comment that we can discuss. The point here is this is not a moral call. This is not a moral judgment if it's good or bad. Obviously, to do an act intentionally generally is worse than doing something by mistake. We're more concerned about the technical criteria that a person is going to have to bring a chatas, a sin offering for doing something unintentional. And so to lose out or to be not qualified for a chatas doesn't necessarily mean good news. It doesn't necessarily mean that you've done something good. It just means that it's missing the technical criteria that are necessary in order to have to bring a chatas. And so, in our cases in the Mishnah, where the person becomes aware, they are exempt from being a carbon chatas because they became aware in the middle of the process. This Mishnah is interesting, but it, in a sense, gives us almost more questions than answers. Let's just recap what the Mishnah says, and then the Gemara will give us interpretations of the Mishnah that may or may not be what we're anticipating. You throw something, and then after throwing it, you realize that you shouldn't be throwing it. You realize that it's Shabbos, as Rashi says. Or, I'm going to leave it ambiguous because that's for the Gemara to decide. Kol ta'achar, if a person catches it, or kel tekelav aisha nisrafa, or if it's intercepted. Otherwise, pater, the person is exempt. If he intends to hurt someone, cause an injury to man or beast, man or animal, and then he recalls mid-process, he again is pater from a chatas. Doesn't mean it's a good thing to do. And then we said there's a general rule. To be chayiv chatas, to have to bring a sin offering, the person needs to be consistently not in his mind, not realizing that it is prohibited from the beginning to the end. That is our Mishnah. That's the story. Any thoughts or comments? Again, realize most of our questions are going to be at least addressed, if not answered, in the Gemara. But I'd love to hear any thoughts here.
Does this Mishnah apply to the situation when you turn the light off unintentionally? That is, you intend to switch the light on, but you forgot it was Shabbos.
You're saying a person forgets his Shabbos and switches the light on,
and then realizes
Shabbos and then shuts it off.
That I didn't say. It might shut off, or it might not shut off. But what about the first phase of the action? That is, he's turning the light on and then realizes, oh, it's Shabbos.
So here's the challenge that I have. And the Gemara is going to have this problem too. But what is the duration of an act?
Mm-hmm.
The flipping a switch, for the most part, is like, it's hard. We certainly could pause the frame and have us mid-action, but it's usually a single motion. And so it's a whole lot harder, although not impossible, to have a person start not realizing it's Shabbos. But I guess it could happen. Actually, it happens a lot where people, and here's the problem, we have a lot of behaviors that are almost or are instinctive. We have a trained instinct. You walk into a room and it's dark, you just hit the switch. You can do it in your sleep. And that's why many people, and this is not a judgment, but many people flip the switch unintentionally, and then they remember that Shabbos, or they realize they don't want to do this, and they instinctively shut it off. And it's really part of the same confusion. It's not that the person's thinking, oh, let me shut the light off because it's Shabbos. No, it's part of a single, and that's, Professor, that's why I added in, because that's where it gets a whole lot more complicated. Because what happens is when the person hits the switch, they realize that they don't want to hit the switch. Their instinctive training is, if you don't want the switch, you hit it down. But if they could catch themselves, they wouldn't actually want to do it. So that's actually a good question. If the shoygig is that you don't realize it's Shabbos, and mid-process you realize it's Shabbos, but you're still operating in a reactionary, instinctive way, well, is that considered a shoygig or a mazid? That's a very good question. I'm certainly not going to try to give you the answer now, but I think our Gemara may have something to say about our question. So, Professor, you asked a simple question. I made it complicated, but it is an interesting question. The advantage of throwing or carrying something is that it's possible that there's a little bit more time. We can kind of freeze the frame. Certainly carrying, but maybe even throwing. And as you're going to see tomorrow, because it's already late, the Gemara actually talks about sometimes you throw something and you have the ability to retract it while in motion. Someone actually here mentioned a while ago that if you throw something and you have a net to catch it back or something, but what if you throw something that's attached to a string? What if you throw a yo-yo that's on a 4-amma string, or some kind of implement that you have the ability to withdraw? When is it landed? Can you really withdraw it? Would that be different than another scenario? So I know I just confused something that's already a little. So long story short, our mission here is really addressing when the state of mind or the action itself takes a unexpected twist. Do those changes, and seemingly those changes introduced either by your awareness or something happening to the item that you threw can cause a person not to be chayiv. Now, Dr. Hammer, this is an interesting point, because being that we are of the opinion, and clearly Shabbos confirms this greatly, that kavana and intent is paramount. Well, what happens in our Mishnah where your intent was 100% to do the action, and the only thing that changed is the facts on the ground? Is that enough to alter a kavana? And so in a way, and conversely, what if your kavana changes mid-flight? Do the act, when does the action and the kavana depart? Are they ever severed? Or do they remain connected until the end of the action? So here we left a bunch of confusing half thoughts over here. But that's what, with Hashem's help, we'll gain a little more clarity tomorrow. The question of how and when and if to parse an action, a malacha, to possibly be exempt off the hook for a chatas. Let's draw our session today to a close. Tomorrow, with Hashem's help, we'll go through the Gemara, and hopefully we'll be able to make a siyum on chapter 11. My dear friends, thank you all for being here today on this wonderful Monday, praying for continued good news and healthy and happy occasions for all of Klal Yisrael, and especially for our dear members of the Chabura. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.